When
Mom, what
Margaret
is it? You
Williams
look so
stood at the
serious.
podium, her
David, I
hands
found
trembling
something
as she
about your
gripped the
father.
microphone,
What is it?
the packed
He had another
auditorium
family.
fell silent.
When I stand at that
For 3
podium,
months
the
since
truth
her
comes
husband's
out.
death,
They need
country
to know
music
the
legend Jake
secrets about
Williams'
Jake
widow
Williams.
had remained hidden from the public eye, refusing interviews and ignoring the countless requests from fans desperate to hear from her. But today, something had changed. The woman who had been Jake's partner for 37 years, who had stood in his shadow while he conquered the music world, was about to reveal truths that would shake everything people thought they knew about the man they'd idolized. The secrets she was about to share wouldn't just honor his memory, they would completely rewrite his legacy. Margaret Williams had always been the type of woman who preferred the background to the spotlight. While her husband Jake commanded stages across America, singing about small-town values and honest living, she managed their home, raised their 3 children, and maintained the careful facade that held their family together. For 37 years, she had been the keeper of secrets, the guardian of truths too complicated for public consumption. The morning everything changed started like any other. Margaret sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where Jake used to write songs at the worn wooden table, surrounded by the silence that had become her constant companion since his death 3 months ago. The coffee grew cold in her cup as she stared at the stack of letters from his record label, each one more urgent than the last, requesting her cooperation in planning a tribute album, a documentary, a memorial concert. She had ignored them all, but this morning was different. This morning, Margaret had found the box. It had been hidden behind Jake's old guitar cases in the basement storage room, a place she rarely ventured. She had only gone down there because their youngest daughter, Sarah, was coming home from college and wanted some of her father's old journals for a school project about family history. What Margaret discovered instead was a cardboard box, unmarked and dusty, filled with documents that made her hands shake as she read them. Birth certificates with names she didn't recognize, legal documents bearing Jake's signature next to dates that didn't match anything she remembered, bank statements showing regular payments to addresses she'd never heard of, and photographs, dozens of them, showing Jake with a woman Margaret had never seen before, holding children who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the man she'd called her husband. Margaret's world, already fragile from grief, crumbled completely as she realized the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Jake Williams, the man who sang about family values and commitment, the man who publicly proclaimed his love for his wife and children at every concert, had been living a double life for decades. The woman in the photographs was beautiful in a quiet, understated way that reminded Margaret of herself in younger years. She had dark hair and kind eyes, and in every picture she looked at Jake with the same adoration Margaret remembered feeling in their early days together. The children, 2 boys and a girl, ranged in age from what appeared to be mid-20s to early teens, suggesting this secret family had existed alongside their own for most of their marriage. As Margaret sat on the basement floor, surrounded by evidence of her husband's deception, she felt something unexpected rise within her. Not just anger, though that was certainly present, but a strange sense of relief. For years, she had attributed Jake's frequent absences to his demanding career, his emotional distance to the pressures of fame, his reluctance to discuss certain periods of his life to his naturally private nature. Now she understood that her instincts had been correct. Something had always been missing from their relationship. Some part of Jake that he had never shared with her. The financial documents revealed a complex web of support that had been carefully hidden from Margaret and their joint accountants. Jake had been sending money regularly to this other family, paying for school tuition, medical bills, and daily living expenses. The amounts were substantial, suggesting these weren't casual affairs or temporary relationships, but a genuine commitment to providing for children he had fathered. Margaret's mind raced through decades of memories, searching for clues she might have missed, the unexplained trips to recording studios in different states, the phone calls he would take in private, always claiming they were about business, the way he would sometimes stare out the window with an expression she could never quite read, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. She thought about their own children. David, now 34 and working as a music producer in Nashville. Jennifer, 31 and teaching elementary school in their hometown. And Sarah, 21 and studying journalism in college. How would they react to learning they had siblings they'd never known existed? How would this knowledge change their understanding of their father, their family, their entire childhood? The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. Margaret realized as she carefully returned the documents to the box. The worst part was the loneliness that came with carrying such knowledge alone. For 3 months, she had been grieving the loss of her husband, while also trying to protect his legacy for their children and his fans. She had given carefully worded interviews when pressed, speaking about Jake's dedication to his craft and his love for his family, all while feeling like she was living in a story someone else had written. Now she faced an impossible choice. She could continue the charade, protecting Jake's reputation and sparing their children the pain of learning about their father's secret life. Or she could find the courage to seek truth, even if it meant destroying the carefully constructed image of the man millions of fans had loved. That evening, Margaret called her best friend Linda, who had been her confidant through all the years of Jake's career. Linda had been the one to encourage Margaret to date the young musician all those years ago, had been her maid of honor at their wedding, and had held Margaret's hand through the difficult periods when Jake's career demands threatened to tear their family apart. "Linda," Margaret said when her friend answered the phone, "I need to see you. Tonight. And I need you to promise me something before you come over." "Of course, honey." "What is it?" "Promise me that whatever I tell you, you won't try to talk me out of what I decide to do about it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Linda had known Margaret long enough to recognize the tone in her voice, the same steely determination that had gotten her through Jake's early struggles, his rise to fame, and the countless challenges that came with being married to a public figure. "I promise," Linda said finally. "I'll be right there." As Margaret waited for her friend to arrive, she made herself a proper dinner for the first time since Jake's funeral. She set the table with their good china, lit candles, and opened a bottle of wine Jake had been saving for a special occasion that never came. If she was going to share the truth for the first time, she was going to do it properly, with dignity and grace, just as she had handled everything else in her life. When Linda arrived, Margaret led her to the living room, where Jake's awards and photographs covered the walls, images of him accepting Grammy nominations, performing at the Grand Ole Opry, posing with other country music legends. In every photo, Jake smiled that charming smile that had first attracted Margaret at a small club in Memphis 39 years ago. "I found something today," Margaret began, setting the box on the coffee table between them. "Something that changes everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about Jake, about our entire life together." Linda reached across and took Margaret's hands in her own. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Margaret nodded, drawing strength from her friend's presence. "Before I show you what's in this box, I want you to know that I've already made up my mind about what I'm going to do. I'm going to find this woman and these children. I'm going to learn the truth about who Jake really was, not just the version of him that belonged to me and our family. Are you sure you're ready for what you might discover?" Margaret looked around the room, filled with memories of the life she thought she'd lived, then turned back to Linda with clear, determined eyes. "I've spent 3 months grieving a man I realize I never really knew. I think it's time I met the real Jake Williams, even if he's gone." With that, she opened the box and began sharing the secrets that would change not just her understanding of her late husband, but the entire narrative of their family's history. As she spoke, Margaret felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about her own life, excitement about discovering truths she'd never suspected, and the strange comfort of finally acknowledging that her marriage had been more complicated than she'd ever allowed herself to admit. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, as Margaret and Linda planned the journey that would take Margaret from the comfortable predictability of her grief into the unknown territory of seeking answers. By the time the sun rose, Margaret had made a decision that would not only change her own life, but would ultimately touch the lives of everyone who had loved Jake Williams, both the man on the stage and the man who had existed in the shadows. The address on the bank statements led Margaret to a small town in eastern Tennessee, 3 hours from her own home but a world away from the life she had known. Hilldale was the kind of place Jake used to sing about in his earlier songs. Rolling hills, Main Street lined with local businesses, and the sense that everyone knew everyone else's business. As Margaret drove through the town square, she wondered how Jake had managed to maintain a relationship here without word somehow getting back to the country music community. She had spent a week preparing for this trip, researching everything she could find about the woman in the photographs. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and according to public records, she owned a small bakery on Main Street called Elena's Kitchen. She had never been married, at least not under that name, and had lived at the same address for over 20 years. The children in the photographs were named Michael, 26, Daniel, 24, and Isabella, 16. Their last name was Vasquez, not Williams, suggesting Jake had never publicly acknowledged them as his children. Margaret parked across the street from Elena's kitchen and sat in her car for nearly an hour, watching the steady stream of customers going in and out. Through the large front window, she could see a woman with the same dark hair from the photographs, moving efficiently between the counter and the kitchen, smiling warmly at each customer. She appeared to be in her early 50s, about the same age as Margaret, and there was something about her manner that suggested strength and independence. Finally, gathering her courage, Margaret crossed the street and entered the bakery. The smell of fresh bread and pastries filled the air, and the walls were decorated with local artwork and photographs of what appeared to be community events and family gatherings. Elena looked up from behind the counter with a welcoming smile that faltered slightly when she saw Margaret's face. "Can I help you?" Elena asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that Margaret couldn't quite place. "Are you Elena Vasquez?" Margaret asked, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone in the bakery could hear it. "Yes, I am." "Do we know each other?" Margaret glanced around the bakery, noting that several other customers were within earshot. "Could we perhaps speak privately? I'm Margaret Williams. I think you knew my husband, Jake." The color drained from Elena's face and she gripped the edge of the counter. For a moment, Margaret thought the woman might faint, but Elena recovered quickly, the same strength Margaret had observed from outside asserting itself. "Maria?" Elena called to a younger woman working in the kitchen. "Can you watch the front for a few minutes? I need to speak with this lady in my office." Elena's office was small but welcoming, filled with family photographs, business records, and children's artwork that had clearly been saved over many years. Margaret recognized some of the same faces from the photographs she'd found in Jake's box, but seeing them in context, graduation pictures, birthday celebrations, everyday moments of family life, made them feel more real, more human. "I wondered if this day would ever come," Elena said quietly, gesturing for Margaret to sit in one of the two chairs facing her desk. "When I heard about Jake's death, I thought about reaching out, but I wasn't sure if you even knew we existed." "I didn't," Margaret replied honestly. "I found some documents after he died. Photographs, financial records, birth certificates. I've spent the last week trying to understand what it all means." Elena nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "What do you want to know?" The question was so direct, so simple, that Margaret felt her carefully rehearsed speech evaporate. "I want to know who he was with you. I want to understand how this happened, how it continued for so long, and why he never told me about you or your children." "Our children," Elena corrected gently. "They're his children too, even if he could never claim them publicly." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of revelation and emotion as Elena shared the story Margaret had never known. She and Jake had met 28 years ago when he was performing at a small venue in the next town over. Elena had been working as a waitress while putting herself through business school, dreaming of opening her own restaurant. Jake had been established in his career but not yet the superstar he would become, still able to move through small towns without being recognized by everyone he met. He came back the next weekend, Elena remembered, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And the weekend after that. He said he liked the way I made coffee, but I think he liked that I treated him like a regular person, not like Jake Williams, the country singer." What had started as a casual relationship during Jake's touring schedule had deepened into genuine love. Elena knew Jake was married, but he had told her his marriage was troubled, that he and Margaret had grown apart, that they were staying together only for the sake of their children. It was a story Margaret realized Jake had probably told himself as much as Elena, a way of justifying the double life he was creating. When Elena became pregnant with Michael, Jake had promised to leave Margaret and make their relationship public. But as his career continued to grow and the stakes got higher, that promise kept getting delayed. When Daniel was born 2 years later, Jake had convinced Elena that going public would destroy not just his career, but would hurt Margaret and their children unnecessarily. "I should have insisted," Elena said, her voice heavy with regret. "I should have demanded that he choose. But I loved him, and I loved our children, and I wanted to believe that somehow we could make it work without hurting anyone. Isabella had been a surprise, born when Elena was 30, and had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. By then, the pattern was established. Jake would visit when his touring schedule allowed, providing financial support and emotional presence when he could, but always returning to his public life and his legal family. He was a good father to our children when he was here, Elena insisted, showing Margaret photo albums filled with images of Jake playing with the kids, teaching Michael to play guitar, helping Daniel with homework, reading bedtime stories to Isabella. He never missed a birthday or Christmas. He came to every school play, every graduation, every important moment he possibly could. Margaret studied the photographs, seeing a version of Jake she had never known existed. In these pictures, he looked relaxed and genuinely happy in a way that seemed different from his demeanor in their own family photos. There was less performance in his smile, less awareness of being watched and judged. Did he ever talk about me? About our children? Margaret asked, not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Elena chose her words carefully. He loved you and your children very much. He talked about David's music talents, Jennifer's teaching, Sarah's writing. He was proud of the life you had built together, the stability you provided. I think that's part of why he could never bring himself to disrupt it. But he loved you too. Yes, Elena said simply. He loved me too. And I think that's what tortured him most, the fact that he was capable of loving two families completely, but could never figure out how to be honest with either of us about the other. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret learned about the logistical complexity of Jake's double life. The recording sessions and touring schedule that took him away from home had been real, but he had also built in extra time to visit Elena and their children. The business trips that sometimes extended longer than expected had often included stops in Hilldale. The phone calls he took in private had been daily conversations with Elena about their children's lives, school activities, and family decisions. Elena showed Margaret report cards and school projects, explaining how Jake had been involved in decisions about the children's education, their extracurricular activities, and their future plans. Michael was now a carpenter, working construction jobs throughout the region. Daniel had followed his father's musical interests and played in a local band, though he performed under his mother's name and had never pursued a professional career. Isabella was a junior in high school, planning to study veterinary medicine in college. Do they know about me? Margaret asked. About their other family? They know Jake was married and had other children, Elena replied. I told them when they were old enough to understand that their father's situation was complicated, that he loved them but couldn't be with us all the time because of his responsibilities to other people. I tried to be honest without making them feel like they were less important than his public family. The conversation was interrupted when the bakery's front door chimed, and Elena excused herself to help a customer. Margaret remained in the office, surrounded by evidence of the life Jake had lived parallel to her own. She picked up a small framed photo from Elena's desk. Jake and Isabella at what appeared to be a father-daughter dance at her school, both of them smiling widely at the camera. When Elena returned, she found Margaret crying quietly. I keep thinking about all the times he told me he wished he could be home more, Margaret said. All the times I felt guilty for resenting his travel schedule, for feeling lonely, for wondering if there was something wrong with our marriage that he seemed so distant sometimes. There wasn't anything wrong with you, Elena said firmly. Jake created an impossible situation for everyone involved. He was trying to be everything to everyone, and in the end, I think he succeeded mostly in making everyone feel like they weren't getting all of him. As the day ended and Elena prepared to close the bakery, she turned to Margaret with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. What happens now? Are you going to tell your children about us? Are you going to expose Jake's secret to his fans? Margaret had been wondering the same thing throughout their conversation. I don't know, she admitted. I came here looking for answers, but every answer just leads to more questions. All I know is that I can't go back to pretending I don't know about you and your children. You're part of Jake's story, and that makes you part of our story too. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Would you like to meet them? Michael and Daniel both live nearby, and Isabella will be home from school soon. I know this is overwhelming, but they've always wanted to know about their other family. They've had questions about you and your children for years. Margaret's first instinct was to say no, to retreat back to the safety of her old understanding of her life. But looking around Elena's office, seeing the evidence of the love Jake had felt for this family, She realized she owed it to everyone involved to try to understand the full scope of what they were all dealing with. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I'd like to meet them, but Elena, I need you to know that I don't know what this means yet. I don't know how to reconcile the man I was married to with the man you loved, or how to explain any of this to my own children." Elena smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since Margaret had walked into her bakery. "We don't have to figure it all out today. But maybe if we start talking to each other, we can begin to understand how to move forward." As Margaret prepared to leave, Elena handed her a manila envelope. "These are copies of some letters Jake wrote to the children over the years, and some pictures I thought you might want to see. Take them home. Look through them when you're ready. Maybe they'll help you understand who he was when he was with us." Driving home that evening, Margaret felt as though she had lived through several lifetimes in the span of a single day. The woman she had met was nothing like what she had expected, not the homewrecker or villain she had imagined, but a person who had been trying to navigate an impossible situation with grace and dignity, much as Margaret herself had been doing all these years. The envelope Elena had given her sat on the passenger seat, and Margaret found herself both eager and terrified to read its contents. She suspected that Jake's letters to his secret children would reveal aspects of his personality and his struggles that she had never seen, and she wasn't sure she was emotionally prepared for more revelations about the man she had thought she knew completely. The letters Elena had given Margaret painted a picture of Jake Williams that was both familiar and startling in its emotional vulnerability. Unlike the confident performer the public knew, or even the sometimes distant husband Margaret remembered, these letters revealed a man deeply conflicted about the choices he had made and the double life he was living. Margaret spent an entire sleepless night reading through years of correspondence between Jake and his secret family. The earliest letters, written when Michael was just a toddler, were filled with promises and plans for a future where Jake could somehow bring his two families together. As the years progressed and his career reached greater heights, the tone shifted to one of regret and resignation, though his love for Elena and their children never wavered. In one letter written to Daniel on his 16th birthday, Jake had written, "I know I can't give you the normal father you deserve, the one who comes to every baseball game and teaches you to drive in your own driveway. I know you have questions about why our family has to be different, why I can't just be your dad the way other fathers are. Someday, when you're older, I hope you'll understand that the hardest thing about loving someone isn't always about what you can give them. Sometimes it's about accepting what you can't give them and trying to be the best version of yourself within those limitations." Margaret found herself crying over letters Jake had written to Isabella about her school achievements, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, and his pride in her independence and strength. He had encouraged Isabella to pursue her education aggressively, to build a life that didn't depend on anyone else, and to never settle for being someone's secret the way Elena had been forced to accept. "Your mother is the strongest woman I know," Jake had written in one letter. "She chose to love me despite knowing she would never have all of me, and she built a beautiful life for you and your brothers while I was trying to figure out how to be two different people at the same time. Don't ever think that what we have is less than what other families have. It's just different. And different doesn't mean wrong." The photographs Elena had included showed a progression of family moments that Margaret realized had been happening parallel to her own family's milestones. While she and Jake had been celebrating David's high school graduation, Jake had also been attending Michael's graduation in Hilldale. When Margaret thought Jake was touring in the Southwest, he had actually been helping Daniel move into his first apartment. The careful scheduling that had made his double life possible was revealed in the meticulous way he had managed to be present for important moments in both families' lives. Margaret also discovered that Jake had been more involved in his secret children's daily lives than she had initially realized. Elena had included copies of report cards Jake had signed, permission slips for school trips, and even handwritten notes Jake had given the children for their lunchboxes. The level of detail and emotional investment was staggering. This wasn't a casual affair or a series of meaningless encounters, but a fully realized parallel family life that Jake had maintained for over 2 decades. The most devastating discovery came in the form of a letter Jake had never sent, dated just 3 months before his death. It was addressed to Margaret, and Elena had found it among Jake's belongings after his funeral. Margaret's hands shook as she read words Jake had apparently been unable to speak aloud. "Margaret, if you're reading this, It means I finally found the courage to tell you the truth, or it means I died before I could find that courage. Either way, I owe you an explanation that's 28 years overdue. I have loved two women completely in my lifetime, and I have been too much of a coward to figure out how to honor both of those loves without destroying the people I care about most. The letter went on to explain Jake's internal struggle, his repeated attempts to leave Elena that always ended with him realizing he couldn't abandon his children, and his equally impossible consideration of leaving Margaret and their family. He wrote about the guilt that had consumed him, the way he had tried to compensate for his deception by being the best husband and father he could be when he was present, and his growing realization that his secret was poisoning all his relationships. I know that learning about Elena and our children will hurt you in ways I can't even imagine. Jake's letter continued, but I hope that someday you'll be able to see that my love for them was never about my love for you being insufficient. The heart doesn't work like a pie, where each piece makes the whole smaller. Sometimes the heart expands in ways that surprise and terrify the person carrying it around. Margaret called Linda the morning after reading the letters, her voice hoarse from crying and lack of sleep. I need to meet them, she said without preamble when Linda answered the phone. Jake's other children. I can't move forward without understanding who they are. Are you sure you're ready for that? Linda asked gently. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready, Margaret admitted. But Elena said they want to meet me too, and I think I owe it to Jake to try to understand the whole story, not just the part of it that belonged to me. Elena arranged for Margaret to meet Michael and Daniel at the bakery the following Saturday when it was closed to the public. Isabella would join them later as Elena wanted to prepare her youngest child more carefully for the emotional complexity of meeting her father's widow. Margaret arrived early and found Elena setting up coffee and pastries in the main seating area. The two women had spoken on the phone several times since their first meeting, and Margaret was beginning to appreciate Elena's direct communication style and emotional maturity. Elena never tried to minimize the pain Margaret was feeling, but she also didn't apologize for her relationship with Jake or the family they had created together. Michael arrived first, and Margaret was startled by how much he resembled David at the same age. He was tall and solidly built, with Jake's dark hair and Margaret's own brown eyes. His handshake was firm but gentle, and he looked directly at Margaret with curiosity rather than hostility. I've wondered about you my whole life, Michael said as they sat down together. Dad talked about you and your kids all the time, but I never imagined I'd actually get to meet you. Daniel joined them a few minutes later, and the family resemblance was even more pronounced. Where Michael had inherited Jake's sturdy build, Daniel was leaner, more like Sarah, but with Jake's musical hands and the same expressive eyes that Margaret remembered falling in love with all those years ago. This is so weird, Daniel said with a nervous laugh, looking back and forth between Margaret and Elena. I feel like I'm meeting a character from a story I've been hearing my whole life. Margaret found herself smiling despite the emotional weight of the situation. That's exactly how I feel too. Your mother has told me so much about you both, but seeing you in person is completely different. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. These young men spoke about Jake with the easy familiarity of children who had grown up with an active, involved father, but they also talked about the confusion and sometimes resentment they had felt about the secrecy surrounding their family. I used to get so mad when Dad would leave, Michael admitted. Mom would explain that he had work obligations and another family who needed him, but I didn't really understand why that meant he couldn't just bring us all together. I thought maybe his other family didn't like us or something. Daniel nodded in agreement. When I got older, I started to understand that Dad was famous and that having two families might hurt his career, but I still didn't get why that mattered more than just being honest. I mean, people get divorced and remarried all the time, right? Why couldn't Dad just do that instead of living like he was in a spy movie? Margaret found herself in the strange position of defending Jake's choices to his children from his secret family. I think your father was trapped by decisions he made early in your relationship with your mother, she said carefully. I don't think he knew how to undo the pattern he had created without hurting everyone involved. Elena, who had been listening quietly, added, Your father was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation. He made the best choices he could with the information and emotional resources he had at the time. As the morning progressed, Margaret learned more about Jake's role in these children's lives. He had coached Michael's Little League team, using a fake name and staying carefully out of any photographs. He had attended Daniel's school concerts, sitting in the back where he wouldn't be recognized but could still show his support. He had helped both boys with their homework over the phone during his touring periods, calling them every night when their mother said it was okay. Dad always said we should be proud of who we were, Daniel shared, but he also made sure we understood that we couldn't talk about him with other people. It was like having this huge secret that was also the most important thing in your life, Michael added. I think that's part of why I became interested in construction and building things. I liked working with my hands, creating something solid and real that didn't have to be hidden from anyone. When Isabella arrived from school that afternoon, Margaret saw Jake most clearly. The teenage girl had her father's smile and his way of tilting her head when she was thinking, but she also had Elena's quiet strength and directness. "So you're the other wife," Isabella said matter-of-factly, settling into a chair across from Margaret. "Dad talked about you a lot. He said you were really smart and that you kept everything organized so he could focus on his music." Margaret was surprised by the girl's casual acceptance of the situation. "How do you feel about all of this? About your father having two families?" Isabella shrugged with teenage nonchalance that reminded Margaret of Sarah at the same age. "It's the only family situation I've ever known, so it doesn't seem that weird to me. I mean, I know it's not normal, but lots of families aren't normal. At least Dad was around and involved, you know? Some of my friends have fathers who left completely." "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Margaret asked. "Sure," Isabella said. "I wish Dad could have come to parent-teacher conferences with Mom, instead of her always having to go alone. I wish I could have posted pictures with him on social media like other kids do with their parents. But I also understand that Dad was trying to protect all of us from something that would have been really messy in public." The conversation with Isabella revealed a level of emotional sophistication that impressed Margaret. Jake's youngest child had clearly given considerable thought to her family's unique circumstances, and she had developed a perspective that was both practical and compassionate. "I want to meet my other siblings," Isabella said as the afternoon drew to a close. "Michael and Daniel have always wondered about your kids, and I've always wanted to know what it would be like to have a sister. Do you think they'd want to meet us?" Margaret realized this was the question she had been avoiding since she first discovered Jake's secret. How could she possibly explain to David, Jennifer, and Sarah that their father had other children? That the man they had mourned was more complicated than any of them had realized? "I haven't told them about you yet," Margaret admitted. "I wanted to understand the situation better before I tried to explain it to them. But I think they deserve to know the truth about their father, even if it's difficult to hear." As Margaret prepared to leave Hilldale, Elena walked her to her car. "Thank you for coming today," Elena said. "I know this can't be easy for you, but I think it means a lot to the kids to know that you don't hate us." "I don't hate you," Margaret replied honestly. "I'm still trying to understand everything, but I can see that you and your children genuinely loved Jake, and that he loved you too. I'm beginning to think that maybe there's enough room in his legacy for all of us." Driving home, Margaret felt the weight of the decisions ahead of her. She had promised Elena she would consider arranging a meeting between all of Jake's children, but she knew that conversation would require her to finally be completely honest with David, Jennifer, and Sarah about their father's secret life. She wasn't sure how they would react, or how the revelation might change their memories of their childhood and their relationship with Jake's memory. But for the first time since finding the box in the basement, Margaret felt like she was moving toward truth, rather than away from it. Jake's story was more complicated than she had ever imagined, but it was also more complete, more human, and in some ways more loving than the simplified version she had been living with. The conversation Margaret had been dreading came on a Sunday evening when all three of her children were gathered at the family home for their weekly dinner. It had been a tradition Jake had insisted on during his lifetime, no matter what was happening with tour schedules or recording sessions. Sunday evenings belonged to family. Margaret had continued the tradition after his death, finding comfort in the routine and the opportunity to stay connected with David, Jennifer, and Sarah as they navigated their own grief. She had spent the entire week preparing for this moment, rehearsing various ways to share what she had discovered. Linda had offered to be present for moral support, but Margaret felt this was something she needed to handle alone with her children. The box of documents and photographs sat on Jake's old desk in his study, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. "I have something I need to tell you all," Margaret said as they finished Elena's homemade apple pie, a small gesture toward honesty that none of her children noticed. "Something about your father that I only learned about recently." David, now 34 and bearing an increasing resemblance to Jake as he aged, looked up from his coffee with concern. "Is everything okay, Mom? You've seemed different lately, kind of distracted." Jennifer, always the most perceptive of the three children, reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Whatever it is, we can handle it. We're all adults now." Sarah, at 21, still young enough to expect her parents to be exactly who she thought they were, looked apprehensive. "Did Dad do something wrong? Is that why you've been acting strange?" Margaret took a deep breath, drawing on the strength she had found during her meetings with Elena and her children. "Your father had another family. For 28 years, he had a relationship with a woman named Elena Vasquez, and they had 3 children together." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret watched her children's faces process the information, seeing confusion give way to disbelief, and then to the beginning of hurt and anger. David was the first to speak. "That's impossible. Dad wasn't that kind of person. He talked about commitment and family values constantly. He would never have cheated on you." "I thought the same thing," Margaret said gently. "But I have documentation, photographs, legal records." He was providing financial support for them, and he was actively involved in their lives. Jennifer's teacher instincts kicked in, and she began asking practical questions. "How do you know this information is accurate? Where did you find these supposed documents? Have you verified any of this independently?" Margaret retrieved the box from Jake's study and placed it on the dining room table. As her children examined the contents, she watched their disbelief transform into reluctant acceptance. The photographs were clearly authentic, and Jake's handwriting on various documents was unmistakably his. "I've met them," Margaret added quietly. "Elena and her children. I went to their town, visited Elena's bakery, and spent time talking with them about their relationship with your father." Sarah's voice was tight with emotion when she finally spoke. "So while we were growing up thinking we had this perfect family, Dad was off playing house with some other woman and her kids? How could you not know about this, Mom?" The accusations stung, partly because Margaret had been asking herself the same question. "Your father was very careful about maintaining his 2 lives separately. The touring schedule, the recording sessions, the business trips, they provided perfect cover for him to spend time with his other family without anyone suspecting." David was studying a photograph of Jake with Michael and Daniel, both boys clearly resembling their father. "These kids look like us," he said wonderingly. "This one could be my brother." "He is your brother," Margaret said. "Michael is 26, Daniel is 24, and Isabella is 16. They're your half-siblings, and they've known about our family their whole lives." Jennifer looked up sharply. "They knew about us?" "What did they know?" Margaret explained Elena's approach to telling her children about Jake's complicated family situation, emphasizing how Elena had tried to help them understand their father's circumstances without making them feel less important than his public family. "So they got the truth, and we got lies," Sarah said bitterly. "That's just great." "I don't think your father saw it as lying to you," Margaret said carefully. "I think he was trying to protect everyone involved from a situation that would have been very difficult to explain publicly." David stood abruptly and began pacing the room. "This explains so much," he said, his voice growing louder. "The way Dad would sometimes seem distracted during family time, like his mind was somewhere else. The phone calls he would take in private. The way he would sometimes look guilty when he came home from tours, like he had something to confess but couldn't bring himself to do it." Jennifer was more analytical in her processing. "The financial records in this box show substantial amounts of money being sent to this other family over the years. Money that could have been used for our education, our family trips, our future. How much of our financial security was compromised by Dad supporting his secret family?" "According to the records, our family finances were never compromised," Margaret replied. "Your father worked harder and took on more projects to ensure he could support both families adequately. If anything, this other family motivated him to be more successful financially." Sarah was crying now, angry tears that reminded Margaret of Jake's emotional intensity. "I can't believe you're defending him. He lied to us our entire lives, Mom." Everything we thought we knew about our family was fake. It wasn't fake, Margaret said firmly. Your father loved us completely. His love for Elena and her children didn't diminish his love for us. It just meant he was carrying more emotional responsibility than we realized. The conversation continued for hours, as Margaret's children worked through their initial shock and began asking more detailed questions. They wanted to know everything: how Jake had met Elena, why he had never divorced Margaret to make his relationship with Elena legitimate, how he had managed the logistics of maintaining two families, and what Elena and her children were like as people. Margaret found herself in the unexpected position of defending both Jake's choices and Elena's character to children who felt betrayed by the revelation that their family story was more complicated than they had believed. She shared details from her conversations with Elena, describing the woman's strength and dignity, and her children's genuine love for their father. Elena never pressured your father to leave us, Margaret explained. She accepted the situation he offered and built a good life for herself and their children within those constraints. She's not the villain in this story. She's just another person who loved your father and tried to make the best of a complex situation. David eventually returned to the table and picked up one of Jake's unsent letters. Can we read these? The letters Dad wrote to them? Margaret hesitated. Some of them are very personal, and they might be painful for you to read. But if you want to understand who your father was when he was with them, the letters will show you a side of him you probably never saw. The three siblings spent the next hour passing Jake's letters among themselves, reading in silence punctuated by occasional gasps or quiet sobs. Margaret watched them discover the same emotional vulnerability she had found in Jake's written words, seeing their father's internal struggle and his deep love for all his children. He sounds so tortured in these letters, Jennifer observed. Like he knew what he was doing was wrong, but couldn't figure out how to fix it without destroying everything. That's exactly how Elena described him, Margaret agreed. She said he was a good man trapped in an impossible situation that he had created but didn't know how to resolve. As the evening wore on, Margaret's children began asking about the possibility of meeting their half-siblings. The anger and sense of betrayal were still present, but curiosity was beginning to emerge alongside the hurt. What are they like? David asked. Do they have any musical talent like Dad? Margaret described her meetings with Michael, Daniel, and Isabella, sharing details about their personalities, their careers and interests, and their relationships with Jake. She was careful to present them as real people with their own feelings and perspectives, not just as evidence of their father's deception. Isabella wants to meet Sarah, Margaret mentioned. She's always wanted to know what it would be like to have a sister. Sarah looked up from the letter she was reading. What did you tell her? I told her I would need to talk with you first, to see how you felt about the idea of meeting. The conversation ended without any firm decisions, but Margaret could see that her children were beginning to process the information and consider the implications for their own understanding of their family. They agreed to take time to think about everything they had learned, and to reconvene the following week to discuss how they wanted to move forward. As David, Jennifer, and Sarah prepared to leave, each of them hugged Margaret with unusual intensity. Despite their shock and hurt over Jake's secret, they seemed to recognize that she was dealing with an even more complex emotional situation. Mom, David said as he was leaving, I want you to know that finding out about Dad's other family doesn't change how I feel about our childhood or our family. It's weird and complicated, but it doesn't erase all the good memories we have. Jennifer echoed his sentiment. You're handling this with incredible grace. I don't know how you're staying so strong while dealing with learning that your entire marriage was more complicated than you thought. Sarah, still the most emotionally raw of the three, simply held Margaret tightly and whispered, I love you, Mom. Whatever we decide to do about meeting them, I love you. After her children left, Margaret sat alone at the dining room table surrounded by the photographs and letters that had upended everyone's understanding of Jake Williams. She realized that telling her children about their father's secret family had been only the first step in a much longer process of redefining their family's story. The real challenge would be deciding how to move forward, whether to keep Jake's two families separate even in death, or to find a way to honor all the relationships he had formed during his lifetime. Margaret was beginning to believe that Jake's legacy was large enough to encompass all the people who had loved him, but she wasn't sure everyone else was ready to embrace that possibility. As she cleaned up the dinner dishes, Margaret found herself thinking about Elena. probably sitting in her own kitchen in Hilldale, wondering how Margaret's children had reacted to learning about their existence. For the first time since discovering Jake's secret, Margaret felt a sense of connection to the other woman who had shared Jake's love and was now trying to navigate the aftermath of his deception. Tomorrow, she would call Elena and share how the conversation had gone. And maybe, if her children were ready, they could begin the process of figuring out how two families who had been kept apart by one man's fear could find a way to honor his memory together. 3 weeks after Margaret told her children about their father's secret family, she found herself standing in the parking lot of a restaurant halfway between her home and Hilldale, waiting for what might be one of the most important meetings of her life. Inside, all of Jake Williams' children were gathering for the first time. David, Jennifer, and Sarah from Margaret's family, and Michael, Daniel, and Isabella from Elena's family. The meeting had been orchestrated carefully after a series of phone calls between Margaret and Elena, with input from all 6 children about their comfort levels and expectations. Everyone had agreed to meet on neutral ground, at a family restaurant in a small town where none of them had any history or memories to complicate the emotional complexity of the situation. Margaret arrived early and chose a large round table in a quiet corner of the restaurant, thinking that the circular arrangement would help everyone feel equal rather than creating an us versus them dynamic. Elena arrived a few minutes later with Isabella, both women greeting each other with the tentative friendship they had been building over their phone conversations. "How are you holding up?" Elena asked as they settled into their seats. "I'm nervous," Margaret admitted. "I keep wondering what Jake would think about this meeting, whether he'd be proud that we're trying to bring his families together or terrified that we're exposing the secret he worked so hard to maintain." Isabella, who had been quiet during the drive, looked directly at Margaret. "Dad would be relieved," she said, with the certainty that only teenagers can possess. "He used to talk about how much he wished we could all know each other. He said his biggest regret was that his children couldn't be friends." Michael and Daniel arrived next, both young men looking as nervous as Margaret felt. They had insisted on driving themselves, wanting the option to leave early if the meeting became too uncomfortable. Margaret introduced them to Elena, whom they had heard about over the years, but had never actually met face-to-face. David, Jennifer, and Sarah came in together, having spent the drive discussing strategy and preparing themselves emotionally for meeting the siblings they had never known existed. Margaret watched as her children encountered Elena for the first time, seeing them try to reconcile this warm, obviously caring woman with their preconceptions about the other woman in their father's life. "Elena," Margaret said, standing to make formal introductions. "These are my children, David, Jennifer, and Sarah. Everyone, this is Elena Vasquez, and you've already met Isabella." The handshakes and polite greetings that followed were awkward but genuine, with everyone clearly trying to be respectful, despite the unusual circumstances. Margaret had suggested they begin with a meal and casual conversation, allowing everyone to get comfortable before diving into more serious discussions about their father and their family relationships. As they ordered food and made small talk, Margaret observed the subtle ways Jake's genetics had manifested in all his children. David and Michael had similar builds and mannerisms. Jennifer and Daniel both had Jake's habit of tilting their heads when they were thinking deeply. Sarah and Isabella shared their father's expressive eyes and quick smiles. The first real breakthrough came when David asked Daniel about his musical interests. "Mom mentioned that you play in a band." "What kind of music?" Daniel's face lit up. "Mostly country and folk rock. I play guitar and write some songs, but I've never tried to make it professional. After growing up watching Dad's career from the outside, I'm not sure I want that kind of life." "I've been producing music in Nashville for about 10 years, David replied. "I'd love to hear some of your work sometime if you're comfortable sharing it." The conversation that followed revealed how much Jake's children had in common beyond their genetics. Michael's interest in construction resonated with Sarah's journalism focus on urban development issues. Jennifer's teaching experience connected with Isabella's academic achievements and college plans. Elena found herself talking with David about the business side of the music industry, sharing insights from her years of managing her own small business. As the meal progressed, Margaret noticed that the initial tension was giving way to genuine curiosity and interest. Jake's children were discovering that they liked each other as people, independent of their complicated family connection. "I have to ask," Jennifer said during a lull in conversation, looking directly at Elena, Did you ever resent us? Dad's legitimate family? Elena considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she said honestly, especially during holidays or important events when Jake couldn't be with us because he was with you. But I tried not to let resentment take root because I knew you children weren't responsible for the adult decisions that created this situation. I resented you, Sarah admitted quietly. When Mom first told us about you, I was angry that you existed, that you had taken some of Dad's attention away from us. But meeting you all today, I can see that you're not villains. You're just people who loved Dad the same way we did. Isabella spoke up from across the table. I used to be jealous that you got to go to public events with Dad, that you could tell people he was your father without it being a secret. But I also knew that you didn't get all of him either. None of us did, because he was trying to be everything to everyone. The conversation gradually moved toward more substantial topics, as everyone became more comfortable. Margaret found herself facilitating discussions about Jake's personality, his parenting style, and the different memories each family had of him. Dad was always trying to teach us about responsibility and hard work, Michael shared. But he also had this playful side, especially when we were younger. He used to make up elaborate stories about the characters in my picture books, giving them whole backstories and adventures. David smiled in recognition. He did the same thing with us. Jennifer used to get frustrated because Dad would never just read the actual story. He always had to embellish and add his own plot twists. He was obsessed with making sure we understood the value of education, Daniel added. Even though his own career was in music, he constantly emphasized that we needed to have skills and knowledge that nobody could take away from us. That's because he didn't finish college himself, Sarah said. He always regretted dropping out to pursue music even though it worked out for him professionally. As the afternoon wore on, Elena excused herself to call her bakery and check on the employee who was covering for her. When she returned, she had a proposal that surprised everyone at the table. I've been thinking, she said, settling back into her seat, about what Jake would want for all of you now that you know about each other. I think he would want his children to have the relationships he never felt like he could facilitate during his lifetime. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. What are you suggesting? I think we should plan some kind of memorial service or celebration of Jake's life that includes everyone who loved him. Not a public event, but something private, where we can all share our memories and acknowledge the full scope of who he was as a person. The suggestion sparked immediate interest from Jake's children, who had all felt like the formal funeral service 3 months earlier had been too focused on Jake's public persona and not enough on the father they had known privately. We could have it at the old family cabin, David suggested. Dad used to take us there when we were kids, and it's private enough that we wouldn't have to worry about media attention or public scrutiny. Would you be comfortable with that? Jennifer asked Elena and her children. Coming to a place that has history with our family? I think Dad would love that, Isabella said immediately. He always talked about that cabin, about teaching you guys to fish there and helping David learn to play guitar on the front porch. Michael and Daniel exchanged glances. Then Michael spoke for both of them. We'd like to be included in something like that. We never got to participate in any formal recognition of Dad's life or death. It would mean a lot to be able to say goodbye properly. Elena looked around the table at all of Jake's children, then turned to Margaret. What do you think? Are you ready for something like that? Margaret realized that somewhere during the course of the afternoon, her perspective on Jake's secret family had fundamentally shifted. These weren't strangers who had disrupted her understanding of her marriage. They were people who had loved Jake deeply and who deserved to be included in honoring his memory. I think it's exactly what Jake would want, Margaret said. He spent his whole adult life keeping the people he loved separated from each other. Maybe it's time we stopped letting his fear control how we relate to each other. The planning that followed was surprisingly smooth, with everyone contributing ideas and taking responsibility for different aspects of the memorial gathering. David offered to coordinate the music, drawing on songs from throughout Jake's career as well as pieces he had written but never recorded. Jennifer volunteered to organize food and logistics, working with Elena to combine family recipes from both households. Sarah and Isabella decided to collaborate on creating a photo display that would chronicle Jake's life with both families. Michael and Daniel asked if they could bring guitars and perform some of Jake's songs together with David, an idea that excited everyone at the table. Margaret suggested they invite Linda and a few other close family friends who had been part of Jake's life for decades and would appreciate understanding the full story. As the meeting concluded and everyone prepared to leave, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion that had been missing since Jake's death. For months, she had been grieving the loss of a man she realized she had never completely known. Today, she had begun to understand the fuller scope of who Jake Williams had been, not just as her husband or as a country music star, but as a father, partner, and human being who had tried to love more people than conventional society typically allows. Elena walked Margaret to her car, both women recognizing that their relationship had evolved into something unexpected but valuable. "Thank you for making this possible," Elena said. "For the last 3 months, my children and I have been grieving Jake's death in isolation, feeling like we couldn't properly honor his memory because we had to keep our relationship with him secret even after he was gone. Thank you for being patient with me while I figured out how to handle learning about your family," Margaret replied. "I don't know what the future holds for all of us, but I'm glad we're not keeping Jake's secret anymore." As Margaret drove home, she thought about the memorial gathering they were planning and realized it would serve multiple purposes. It would allow Jake's children to develop relationships with each other, give Elena and her family a proper opportunity to say goodbye, and provide Margaret with a sense of closure that acknowledged the complexity of the man she had loved for 37 years. Most importantly, it would honor Jake's memory in a way that embraced all aspects of who he had been, rather than protecting only the parts that fit conventional expectations. Margaret suspected that Jake would be both amazed and relieved to know that the secret he had carried for so long had ultimately brought together the people he loved most, rather than driving them apart. The memorial service they were planning would not erase the pain of Jake's deception or magically resolve all the complex emotions involved in discovering his double life. But it would mark the beginning of a new chapter in which Jake's legacy included all the relationships he had formed and all the love he had given, even when that love had been complicated by circumstances he felt unable to change. For the first time since finding the box in her basement, Margaret felt like she was moving forward rather than simply trying to understand the past. Jake Williams' story was bigger and more complex than she had ever imagined, but it was also more complete, more human, and ultimately more loving than the simplified version she had been protecting. The true story of Jake Williams wasn't just about his music career or his public persona. It was about a man who had loved 2 families completely and had spent his lifetime trying to honor both of those loves while navigating a society that insisted he had to choose. In death, Jake was finally going to get what he had always wanted, all his children together, acknowledging each other as family and celebrating the complicated but genuine love he had given each of them.